Time for another episode from the Anecdote Jar. I like talking about the way things were in the old days, before the internet. Some of my younger friends just stare at me in awe when I talk about the fact that once there was not an internet and no cell phones, and we played our music with these vinyl discs that spun around. Actually, they probably look at me in complete boredom. But anyway, back in the dark ages, I went to graduate school at a large mid-Atlantic university in engineering school, and I was involved with an experiment. And let me tell you about this experiment. Basically, the idea was that this experiment measured sound waves, took the sound field data, and we analyzed that data in order to predict the nature of the overall sound field. In short, this was a Cold War type of experiment where basically we were looking into methods of measuring sound in order to understand how things behaved underwater, how sound behaved underwater, so that the bad guys couldn't hear the movements and motors of our submarines. Our experiment was controlled by a microprocessor, which I think had about 1K of memory in it, and probably its speed was measured by thousands of instructions per second. And it had a control program in it, which I will describe later how that control program was brought into the microprocessor. It had a vast 16 kilobytes of memory to store the data. It had an interface to the sound recording part of the experiment, as well as motors that moved the microphones from place to place. It also had a monitor, which was just a terminal which typed characters line by line, and a tape recorder to store the data. Now, this tape recorder was one of those giant tape recorders you see in pictures of old-fashioned computers, like about the size of a dishwasher. And the only reason we had that was because it fell off the back of a truck. It was intended for the computer center, and they said we could have it if we could fix it up and get it to work. And one of our super geeks in the department was able to write the program that controlled this tape recorder, which in itself was a pretty major project. Now, how did we get the control program into the microprocessor? We used assembly language, which was about one step more sophisticated than actually programming raw ones and zeros into the computer. Now, this assembly language program was stored at the computer center, more on the computer center later. We typed this program in assembly language into a file at the computer center using our monitor, which was, by the way, quite sophisticated and quite advanced, because in those days a lot of people just used punch cards for their data and programming. Anyway, once we composed this assembly language file, we compiled it. A compiler is just a large program that translates the assembly language into the ones and zeros that the computer understands. So we would compile a program and wait for the output from the compiler. What that means is we usually had to wait overnight to get a printout to see how many ways that our program was wrong, and we had to go back and correct it. Once the program compiled correctly, then that was a day of celebration. Then we could actually move the code into the microprocessor. That meant we used our version of the internet in those days, which was a 300 baud phone line, to transfer our program into the microprocessor, which, by my recollection, took about a half an hour. Then once the program is sitting on a microprocessor, you hope the power didn't go out, because we would have to wait that half an hour again. And then turn on the microprocessor, and it controlled the program, moved the microphones around, and recorded data in that 16K of memory temporarily until when that was full, that data was moved to the giant tape recorder, which moved, you could see the reels move about 1 inch every time it recorded some data. Great, so now we have data recorded on our tape. Then we'd have to take that tape physically over to the computer center and analyze the data on the tape. How was that done? Well, meanwhile, we had been writing this program in Fortran that took our data and analyzed it so that it could predict the nature of the sound field using Fourier transforms and a bunch of sophisticated math. But anyways, that took a number of cycles of getting that right in the meantime. So once that program we think is working okay, then we use it to analyze our actual data, and the computer center stores that analysis data in one of its files over there. And then the next problem is, well, what do we do with that in order to figure out whether everything is working or not? Because there was no such thing as computer graphics in those days. And you have to try to picture this. There was no such thing as computer graphics. You didn't look at a screen and see pictures of things. It just did not happen in those days. How did you make pictures? We had a pen plotter that moved a little felt tip pen up and down X and Y axes in order to create a picture on a piece of paper. Now that was another job. I had many failures in trying to get that thing to work. But once it did work, finally, we got to see our sound fields. That's a little bit demoralizing to think about the fact that these days that whole process would take about 20 seconds using an iPhone. But that's how we did it back then, and I have the pen plots to prove it. It's amazing to think that I went to graduate school before the days of the internet, and I'm not doing very well. I'm not really doing very well. Let me drink some water.